Today we're going to take a look at how to suggest the light in our subject. And if I could reduce the goals in my painting to just one, it would be to suggest the light of the subject that I'm looking at. Because the light is what sets up the form, the shape, it sets up the color. Everything we need to know comes from being able to suggest the light. So there's several things we want to think about. The first one is, as with everything else, we always have to simplify what we're looking at to 4 to 6 big masses and shapes and get the right value relationship, maybe a dark and a light of each shape of those 4 to 6 shapes. That sounds simplistic, but that's kind of the idea, is to simplify things so that we could get to what's important and not worry about all the detail and stuff that really doesn't matter. The next thing is to get the right value relationships, a simple dark and light in each big shape. And then lastly is temperature contrast. So value contrast and color temperature contrast. Getting the right contrast of warm and cool color, which is a big part of suggesting the light. So we're going to take a look at some artists from Taos, New Mexico. It's the Taos Art Colony. It was formed in 1915 by 6 artists, and it lasted until 1927, and they had about 12 artists. And we're going to take a look at 4. We're going to take a look at E.I. Kus, E. Martin Hennings, Oscar Burninghouse, and Joseph Sharp. Look at a few of their paintings each and see how they suggested the light in their paintings. So here's a photograph of some of the 12. I think this is Buck Denton here. We're not looking at his work. I'm thinking this is Joseph Sharp. I'm not real sure. This really looks like Oscar Burninghouse. And I think that's E.I. Kus there. I'm not sure about the others in there. So all kind of a guess. But I was at the Kus Sharp Museum, which is their studio. This is E.I. Kus's studio here in Taos. And here is Joseph Sharp's. Nice adobe. This is actually his adobe outhouse. And this is his studio back in here. But beautiful area. Of course, all of Taos is a beautiful area to kind of look at and paint. Here's kind of a back way into his studio. But inside, it was a great way to see an artist studio from the 1920s, 1930s. I guess when he passed away, they closed up the studio and didn't reopen it until, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago. Fairly recent. And everything is pretty much as it was. The paintings, the paints, the brushes, the drawings that were around, they were all just left as they were. A lot of his still life and figurative things that he painted were laying around, as well as the rack of frames up here. So it was a really nice way to see how an artist set up his studio back in those days. This was the north light that he painted by. No nighttime painting, unless they had some other way of lighting the studio. But a lot of his paintings, a lot of the pots, the Indian pots that he had in his collection, really interesting. This was a start of a painting that was on his easel. You can see he had an interesting way of starting out, scrubbing the big shapes that he has. In this case, he outlined them fairly definitely and blocked in several values, big shapes, to kind of get the big solid masses started. But it's interesting how he did it, kind of a dry brush, chopping in some brush strokes around. You can see the brush strokes here on the figure are showing the form real well because he's following the form of the arm. But definite color. Black hair, so he's starting with blue. Don't know quite why he would start with blue, but there's a lot of blue in black. And just simple, basic colors and values to get it started. I thought that was interesting as a start for a painting. This was his painting box. As he left it, it's interesting, he had Rembrandt paint, a lot of Rembrandt paint, which I didn't realize it was that old, and Weber, which the only Weber paint now I see is the Primalba white. That soft mixing white. But he had a lot of Weber colors as well. So they must have made paint back then, more than just the white. Again, a lot of his paintings were in there. This was the model stand with the curtain background behind there, where a lot of, even this one, though it's set outside, I'm sure the model was on the stand. All these models here were probably painted on this model stand right here. Didn't rely on photographs. This is just outside the studio. Another room, really interesting, nice fireplace. Beautiful painting here, really large, probably before he came to Taos. He studied, I think he studied in France. I know he was at New York, probably Art Students League. So figurative painting before he came. But in Taos, his subject was mostly the Indian culture, landscape, figures of that area. But the big thing is always suggesting the light. And with his paintings, especially his landscapes, big solid areas of just light and dark. Light part of the rock being hit by the moonlight. Shadow part of the rock. All the rocks, just simple dark and light. Figure, simple dark and light. So reducing your values to 2 to 3 values on each big shape makes it so much easier to suggest the light. Don't go for the subtlety, like the real subtle halftones that we see maybe in some of the light areas, or the subtle value changes on the shadow side. Just get big, simple, dark, and light, then go to the subtlety. But don't lose that initial contrast that you get between the big shapes of dark and light. And all these artists have kept that, even though they're doing more subtle things within those big shapes. They don't lose the contrast. And I think that's the key. It sounds simplistic, but we are so geared towards detail that we lose that so easily. Here, again, on the rock background, you have a simple light on the rock and a simple dark shadow here cast from the figure. Same thing on the figure itself, a light and a dark pattern. Now, there's more stuff going on in the light. As the back of the Indian turns, it gets redder and a little darker, and it's lightest right here. But it's overall lighter than the shadow. Keeping those two extreme values separate is the most important thing. Now, this was not outside, inside, not a landscape, but the same thing holds true. The light you can see is hitting here on the forehead, here on the shoulder, here on the arm, here on the leg. So those are the lightest spots. And then as the form turns, it gradually gets darker. So a little more complicated here because there's not that real strong direct light, probably light from a north window, which is more subtle. But there's still strong dark and light, finding where the lights are. And then as the form starts to turn around, like on the shoulder here, it turns to more of a darker halftone and turns to the darker shadow over here. Look for those simple value changes. Of course, getting the proportions and drawing is one of the main things as well, too. And that just takes time of practicing drawing figures, landscapes, to understand how to capture the form. But to suggest the light, and this is one of his pencil drawings, it's done on a toned paper and is using white chalk or a white colored pencil, white pastel, and then a dark pencil. So he has, the simple light and the dark on the figure. Very, very simple. Again, the proportions are right, shape is right, but getting that simple value change there and in the rock, simple dark trees against a light sky, extreme value contrast of the big shapes. That's the most important. Now we turn to Oscar Burninghouse, who all his paintings here are outside. And again, he captured the light really well. It's not a great image of the painting. Color's a little dark, but definitely captured the light. It's backlighting, the light coming through the white blanket there. Light just hitting the edge of the figure in his clothes. There's a lot of variation, a lot of subtlety in here, but it's the big masses the light blanket against the dark figure, and the simple light and dark of the trees. There's a lot going on, so it is a complicated composition. But in order to paint it, you have to simplify it first and get the big, simple values and get them correct. A lot of subtlety here. Some of the shadows are real light, and some of the lights are a little bit darker, but you still have the extremes of the strong dark and light that he captures. He was, Oscar Burninghouse was from St. Louis, and he taught figure drawing at night at the St. Louis School of Fine Art, which I think eventually was Washington University. But my great uncle went to art school there, teens and early 20s, and Oscar Burninghouse was his figure drawing teacher. So I have all his figure drawings, and he told me that Oscar would sit down to show you something and ended up doing the whole drawing. So I'd like to think I have Oscar Burninghouse figure charcoal drawings from life, but there's no signature. I'll have to show those sometime. Here's a nice scene. Again, he's simplifying things to the big dark shape of the mountain that's in shadow, cloud shadow, and the sunlight blasting the hay here. And again, the simple dark and light contrast, the light mule or horse against the shadowed background, the light building against the slightly darker hay. Everything is bigger, simpler shapes where he's setting up contrast of dark and against light. And again, there's subtlety once you establish those big darks and lights. But learn to establish the big, simple values first, the extremes first, before you start thinking about subtlety. It's a beautiful painting. It's a nice one, too. Again, it's either late afternoon, early morning because of the long shadows. But here, the really warm sunlight set against the really cool shadow. The values are big and simple. They're extreme values, strong dark, strong light. But it's the temperature contrast also, along with the value contrast, that suggests the light. Same thing with this. The extreme cool of the blue-violet hills against the really extreme warm yellow of the hay creates a lot of temperature contrast that really makes the painting a lot stronger. I mean, without that temperature contrast of the warm against the cool, you would not suggest the light as well. Same thing here, a bit more subtle, a bit more midday, so not the real long shadows, but the simplicity of the background. This looks like a smaller outdoor sketch. Simplicity of the background, the simple value on the grass, the road, the simple dark and light pattern on the adobe and the hay and the fence. Somewhat complicated because there's a lot going on in some of those areas, but I'm sure he simplified it a lot more than what was really there, especially in the background, to make this foreground stuff stand out. Now we'll turn to E. Martin Hennings. And here the light source, the sun, is in the background. Things are kind of backlit, and just light is peeking through or sifting through the foliage in this cottonwood, hitting the figures, or this figure at least, a little bit. So the strong dark and light is concentrated just right here as far as sunlight and shadow goes. Now you have dark blanket against a light blanket. They're both in shadow, but there's still a lot of contrast there as well. So a lot of strong value contrast, and the temperature contrast is the bluish background that peeks through the foliage once in a while, and the yellow foliage, and then the cool colors on the figures as they're in shadow. Now this figure has an orange blanket, which is warm, but it's still in the shadow. So it has to be cool just slightly, as opposed to the sunlit yellow foliage. So another one here, again, very strong sunlight hitting the trees, strong shadows. I think it's a shadow pattern within that foliage. And if you can capture that pattern of dark within the yellow foliage, it really creates more strong value and temperature contrast. In other words, design that pattern of shadow. Don't just randomly stick a bunch of dark yellows in there. there's a definite design to how we put that pattern in there to make it work better. But simplified the value to the light yellow, dark yellow. Same thing with the tree trunks, some shadow on the trunks and sunlight. Big, simple areas and getting the right value relationships between them. And what I mean by that, getting the right value relationships, is that the background hill is a value compared to the light tree trunk or compared to the dark foliage. So get that relationship right. If I get the mountains too dark or too light, or get the tree trunks too dark or too light, then the light isn't captured as well, if at all. So get the right relationship between those big shapes. And it takes a while, I think, just to learn to simplify. Your value relationships may be off, but maybe you're able to simplify the shapes a lot better. And then just keep at it, because eventually the value relationships start to work as well. It's a long process, and sometimes it just comes one step at a time. Now here's Joseph Sharp. It's one of the studios, I think, of the Colony members. I don't know which one. Blumenshine, I think, looks like his studio. This is a cloudy day, so there's not bright sunlight, but there's still the big, simple masses of 2 values in the sky. It's got about 3 values in the foliage in this tree, maybe 3 values of greens in the garden, and then the values of the flowers and the values of the adobe as well. So cloudy day, not a lot of strong contrast from cast shadows and bright sunlight, but you still have the darks of the tree, darks of the greens in the garden and inside the house. So the value contrast comes from the big shapes. How much darker the adobe is than the white clouds, how much darker the blue sky is than the white clouds, and so on. So compare and get the right value relationship between those. And if you can simplify the shapes, it's a lot easier to get the right value relationship. Got a couple of teepee paintings of Sharp's, and I don't think these are Taos. I think these are in Wyoming. He painted at Indian Reservation, I think in Wyoming. And here's a night scene. And not all night is just a really dark black sky. Here the bright moonlight is making the sky fairly light, but not as light as the firelight within the teepee. That's kind of the light source on everything. Although the moonlight is hitting the snowy mountains, making them kind of a bluish green, because that's the type of light that comes from the moon, where the light from the fire is real warm. So that's more yellow, yellow-orange, and orange. But simplifying the shapes of the figures, really simplifying the trees. They look detailed, but they're pretty much reduced to shapes and masses. And then the simple dark and light on the ground of the snow and the grass. And understanding where the light's coming from the moon and from the teepee. And just getting those value relationships. It helps maybe to establish where your lightest light is at some point. Here it's the effect of the fire inside the teepee. Then the darkest dark would be in the figures, or maybe the teepee up back in here. Probably up in here, these 2 figures, and then the teepee there are your darkest darks. Then all the other shadows are a bit lighter. Same thing with the lights. These are the lightest lights. Then all the other lights are just a bit darker. All right, well, let's look at an example, a step-by-step of a painting of mine. This is a scene in Yosemite, and I didn't paint this there. I took the photograph. The shadows are long, a long cast shadow here, so I think it's afternoon, from the mountains on the right, and strong sunlight and shadow on the mountains, the cliffs here. And that's what I want to capture, what the light is doing to those. And here's the drawing stage on the canvas. I've got the big shadow pattern of the cliff and just simple light and dark. I don't need to show a bunch of variation of values in the light or the shadow. Same thing with the trees. I just need to show that they're darker than the shadow on the mountain. And then the water, it's a little lighter than the trees, and so on. So this sets up the big shapes. It's more simplified than the photograph. I kind of designed and eliminated some of the trees. As you can see in the photograph, it's just the trees are everywhere thrown in there. So I kind of got rid of some of them, kind of opened it up a little bit, just so your eye could kind of carry into the background a little bit more. Then started blocking in color. Everything in the background is going to be a bit cooler, even the sunlit areas. It's kind of an orange and a blue to get that kind of warmish gray. And then blue and yellow ochre for the green that's there. If I had any green up front, it would be blue and cad yellow, which would be stronger. I want to stick with more yellow ochre and blue in the background so that it doesn't come forward as much. Then a simple value change in the sky. I've got pretty much just two values, the lighter blue, it's a little phthalo, and then darker with ultramarine. And more of just a yellow-orange in this field here, a simple dark and a light. Then I'm making simplified changes in here. I'm getting a bit more sunlight in this shadow area, just to show a little more contrast. And then the value of the water. And how dark or light is the water compared to the sky? And I have it a little bit darker than the sky. I don't want them the same. And a simple dark and light for the trees. Then a bit more, doing a bit more variation within the lights on the mountain. So I have a light and a halftone here on the cliff, and then the green. It's about all the subtle change I have. Kept everything pretty big and simple, but everything is filled in. Got the details in front of the logs that kind of pull the eye along this line, or these shapes in the water, and then on up here into the cliffs. And then here finally is the finished version. You can see the water was a little darker. This camera just did not pick up how dark that water was. But water's a little darker, so it looks like it's in the shadow. It's reflecting the sunlit sky, but it's going to be darker than any of the sunlit areas. So keeping that water, while it's still kind of a light shadowed area, it's the lightest shadowed area, but it's still a dark compared to the sunlit areas. And simplicity in the trees, I have about two values, just to show a little bit of form in the trees. Too many value changes in the big shapes are going to cause you to lose your sunlight or the effect of light, even on a cloudy day. So details will really kill the effect of sunlight in your painting if you overdo it. We need some detail. I've got some here in the front, some in the grassy area there, some in the trees, and some in the cliff, but I've really reduced them compared to the photograph. So remember, you want to simplify your subject so that it's 4 to 6 big masses that you can find the simple dark and light shapes to, and then look for strong value contrast and strong temperature contrast.